First off, I want to thank you all for the amazing support you've shown to the podcast. How many times you have started hours-long podcast and never able to finish, and when you went back, you find it difficult to connect with podcasts. To avoid that, please subscribe to most advanced, featured, and accurate quick podcast summaries on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. It will save you from spending 15 to 20 hours per week catching up. It's a great way to stay informed while saving time for less than the price of candy in most places. Here's a rundown on Hungary Prime Minister Viktor Orban, on USAID, Trump, immigration, NATO, and the Russia-Ukraine war, featuring Viktor Orban by Tucker Carlson, Guides. Tucker Carlson reminisced about his first interview with Orban several years ago, when his ideas were considered eccentric and radical.
Orban's emphasis on the middle class, families, and secure borders was seen as a threat to the liberal elite.
Carlson wondered if Orban felt vindicated by the current state of Europe, which had not followed his ideas.
Orban acknowledged that his country had been a kind of hero and an island of difference in the liberal ocean. However, with the rise of Donald Trump, Orban's ideas were no longer seen as radical. Trump's presidency had changed the mindset of the West, making it more acceptable to prioritize national interests and traditional values. Orban credited Trump with making it easier for Hungary to survive, as the American boot was no longer on their chest.
Carlson recalled a conversation with one of Orban's advisors, who had whispered about the U.S. government working against Hungary, funding opposition groups, and trying to subvert democracy.
Orban confirmed that this was true, stating that the liberal elite had used taxpayer money to spread their ideology and finance NGOs, politicians, and media outlets in Hungary. He believed that the motive behind this was not only ideological but also driven by money, as speculators like George Soros sought to profit from changing governments and economies. Orban argued that the left was ideologically driven, believing that migration and diversity would create a better society.
Carlson pointed out that the push for unrestricted migration was only directed at Western countries, not at nations like China, India, or Japan.
Orban attributed this to the intellectual history of European political thinking, which had a strong leftist liberal community that sought to destroy Western civilization. He believed that this community was ashamed of their nation and sought to improve it by destroying it. Orban argued that the experiment of unrestricted migration had failed in Europe, citing the problems of terrorism, public disorder, and erosion of democracy. He stated that the elite was committed to this ideology, making it difficult to change their position, and that this led to a problem of democracy.
Orban defined democracy as the participation of the people in major decisions, resulting in good governance, and warned that Europe was heading towards anarchy. Carlson asked about the state of the German economy, which he saw as the dominant economic player in Europe.
Orban assessed that the German economy was part of the European problem, as the single market was in trouble. He noted that the European Union was no longer the largest economy in the world, and that the success of the EU was strongly linked to the success of the German economy, which was currently suffering. The structural model that once worked, combining cheap Russian energy with advanced European technology, is no longer functional. After the war, Europe isolated itself from cheap energy, and there's no new strategy in place to maintain competitiveness. This lack of direction has led to a lack of leadership, ideas, and vision, causing Europe to suffer. Meanwhile, China and the United States are in a better position, with President Trump's return to power being a significant factor. The Biden administration's decision to impose the Green New Deal on Germany by blowing up Nord Stream has been described as an act of industrial terrorism. This has raised questions about the existence of NATO and the silence surrounding the issue. The alliance between the American liberal elite and the European liberal elite has played a significant role in suppressing discussions about the Nord Stream incident. This alliance has managed to silence voices that tried to raise questions about the issue, and the Germans have been part of this transatlantic liberal alliance. The fortunes of Europe matter to the United States, as the economic and security conditions of Europe are closely tied to the West. However, the new administration in the US has a different approach to other economies, focusing on trade balances. Europe is seen as a zero-sum game, with the US losing $500 billion to China. The European Union is at a watershed moment, with the Draghi report warning that if nothing is done to reduce energy prices and make Europe competitive, the European economy will be over. The EU needs to find a strategy to keep capital inside the Union and make deals with the US to reshape the imbalanced trade relationship. Hungary has a different approach, focusing on connectivity rather than blocking. The country has built good relations with the new Republican administration and maintained cooperation with the Russians. The EU's policy of launching wars with potential partners, such as China and Russia, is seen as a bad policy. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has been denounced as a Putin puppet in the press, but he denies this, stating that he is a pro-Hungarian leader who serves his nation. He has a pragmatic approach to relations with Russia, focusing on economic cooperation and finding reasonable agreements. Orban believes that the war between Ukraine and Russia is not just about Ukraine, but about the enlargement of NATO, and that the Russians will never accept it. Orban's strategy for Hungary is to have a good relation with the US and make deals on the economy. He's working on creating an economic policy that will make Hungary successful, even if the European Union exists or not. The problem is that the European Union is led by bureaucrats who are not capable of providing political leadership, and the only possibility for leadership is if the French and German governments take the lead. However, this is not the case at the moment. The European institutions are unable to reform and provide leadership. And the only way to have leadership is if the French and German governments take the lead. Orban believes that the EU's policy of launching wars with potential partners is a bad policy and that connectivity is the way forward. He also believes that the EU needs to find a strategy to keep capital inside the Union and make deals with the US to reshape the imbalanced trade relationship. He thinks that the Western strategy of keeping the conflict going will only lead to more casualties, deaths, and economic losses. Orban was the only one who voted against the European Union's involvement in the war, but now Slovakia and the Vatican are following a similar track. He also mentions that Donald Trump is now on the same track as Hungary, which is a positive development. Orban thinks that the Biden administration wanted the war to continue, and he's not sure why the UK is so intent on killing Ukrainians. He believes that the war has had a devastating impact on Europe, with Hungary losing around 7 billion euros every year due to sanctions and the war. The war has also led to the isolation of Russia from the European economy, including energy, which will have long-term consequences. Orban also mentions that the war has caused a massive refugee crisis, with tens of millions of Ukrainians fleeing the country. Orban thinks that the only way to find a solution to the conflict is to make a bigger basket that incorporates the issue of reintegrating Russia into the international security order and finding a way of economic cooperation, including energy with Ukraine. Orban also discusses the impact of the war on the global economy, including the deep integration of Russia with China, which he believes is a historical mistake that will have consequences for at least 100 years. He thinks that Russia will never come back to the West as it was before, and that the war has converted the buffer zone between NATO and Russia into a war zone.
Orban recalls a conversation with Tucker Carlson 2.5 years ago, where he said that Russia would win the war due to its larger population. He believes that Western policymakers should have known this, but they were misled by their own interpretation of the Second World War and their desire to integrate Russia into the world economy.
Orban also mentions that the Russians were not satisfied with the way they were integrated into the world economy in the 1990s, and that President Putin's ascension to power marked a change in their approach. He believes that there is a personal revenge element in the way Western businesses and policymakers think about Russia. He offers a nuanced analysis of the situation, highlighting the complexities of the conflict and the need for a more comprehensive approach to finding a solution. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, acknowledges that it's Ukraine's decision to make, but notes that the West's intention was misunderstood by Ukraine. He believes that the West would not support Ukraine forever and that Ukraine's behavior was not exactly normal in communicating with the West. Orban also expresses concern about the effect of Western weapons flowing into Ukraine on his country's security.
Tucker Carlson asks Orban to rate Zelensky as the leader of Ukraine, and Orban responds that he is cautious in making critical remarks, given the heroic fight and sacrifice of the Ukrainian people. However, he notes that Ukraine's decision to go to war was a misunderstanding of the West's intentions and that the West would not support Ukraine forever. The conversation then turns to the issue of Western weapons flowing into Ukraine, with Carlson expressing concern about the effect on European security.
Orban agrees. noting that Hungary has a problem with Russia, but soon will have another problem with Ukraine. Orban responds that it's difficult to imagine European leaders changing their position, given the strong pressure from liberal public opinion. However, he notes that the American decision could be a turning point, and that it's time for European leaders to sober up.
Carlson asks Orban if he thinks it's possible to see a permanent resolution to the conflict within the next 6 months, and Orban responds that it's definitely possible, even earlier. He notes that strong leaders make peace, and that weak leaders make war.
The conversation then turns to the topic of democracy and freedom in Europe, with Orban noting that Central European countries have a different perspective on these issues than Western European countries. He notes that Central European countries have fought for democracy and freedom, and are therefore more committed to these values. Orban also discusses the results of opinion polls on European public opinion, noting that the majority of Europeans are moving towards a pro-peace position. However, he also notes that there is a structural difference between Western and Central European countries, with Western countries being more pessimistic about the future. Thank you for tuning in. Please click follow button, and just remember, subscription is only $1 per month. Leave a comment or review. Until next time, happy listening.